definitely definitely makes for a far more human experience of learning together rather than looking at blank screens. Thanks. So at some point, even for a little while, if your bandwidth allows, please turn on your cameras and we'll at least be able to interact better. So today, I'm tasked with taking you through psychosocial assessment and why this is so essential to the work that we do, and in what ways it is relevant. So last session, you have heard about the interdisciplinary team and how it functions. And palliative care is one of those fields where it's essential for all clinicians. And when I say clinicians, I also mean social workers, I also mean counselors, I also mean, sorry, my windows are going to be slamming. I'll just excuse myself in between to shut that window. So I mean, all members of the interdisciplinary team are really required to work in lockstep with one another. And while we can't take on each other's professional roles, we certainly have to be aware of the different perspectives that our colleagues, our team members bring, because only then can we provide true holistic care. So today I'm going to specifically talk to you about psychosocial care and why in many ways it lays the foundation for how the patient and the family is then treated, and not just medically. So I'm just going to share my screen. I'd like to also give credit to my colleagues, Sharat Mohan and also Sharat K, who have both. Sharat is a past social worker with us. Sharat K is currently with us. And a lot of the work that has gone into this PowerPoint has come from both of them as well. So I just want to give them that credit. So let's get started. We know that the WHO defines palliative care as an approach that improves the quality of life. And I've highlighted a couple of phrases here just to emphasize that, and I've underlined certain words as well. Because when you read this whole paragraph at one shot, it's a mouthful. It's a really wordy definition. And by the time I find that I get to the end of the definition, I've forgotten what the first half of the definition is. So just really emphasis on some important aspects. Quality of life is what we're looking at. And very essentially, it's not just the patient, but also the family. So palliative care considers the family the unit of care, not just the patient only. These are for people facing problems associated with life-threatening illness. This has now been expanded to include life-limiting conditions as well, through the prevention and relief. So very important for us to remember, it's not just the relief of existing suffering, but also to prevent the suffering that might happen as a result of the disease and illness. And how do we do this? By means of early identification, as early as possible, and impeccable assessment and treatment of pain and other problems, physical, psychosocial, and spiritual. So all of these are clearly outlined. And I highlighted impeccable assessment in red because there's sometimes a tendency to not take psychosocial assessment as seriously as medical assessment. If you were to go wrong with medical assessment, I mean, it would be an unforgivable mistake if you got things like a diagnosis wrong or, some symptom control measure wrong or whatever. But somehow people tend to think that, okay, psychosocial assessment is more qualitative. So, there is a tendency also to miss out on a few things. So impeccable assessment is really important. And what are those components of impeccable assessment is what I'm hoping to share with you today. So firstly, the question is, why is psychosocial care important? And I just talked about that a little bit, but I just want to go through these points specifically. And if anyone wants to help me out by reading out some of these points, that'll really be great. Because I'd like to get more and more people, to speak up in this session. Okay, so firstly, living with a life-limiting or life-threatening illness, or even the awareness that, life is limited in that sense, or death is approaching, causes unique stressors and challenges. There are challenges that people facing a life-limiting or life-threatening illness, they face that is not found in any other scenario. And therefore, it's very essential to understand how the disease or the illness has impacted them in those domains. And it's only when you look into the psychosocial aspects of care can you really focus on the quality of life of the person and come up with appropriate measures of caring for them in that regard. So when I go back to the definition of the WHO definition of palliative care, it is a focus on the quality of life of the patient and the family. And it's the psychosocial aspects of care that will tell us about what the quality of life of that patient is and how we can improve it for the patient and for the family. We do something like a social diagnosis, which is very, very important because that tells us, about the context in which the person is existing. And so much of humans are social animals and we are part of a community, whether we want to be or not. And so much of our well-being or the nature of the service delivery or access and availability of interventions has to do with our context, our social context, health-seeking behavior of different demographics, availability of resources in different contexts, even gender inequity in terms of management of one's health. All of those factors come into play. And so social diagnosis is very, very, very critical because you can't just look at the person in and of themselves. You have to see where they exist in the larger fabric. And a serious illness disrupts individuals' thoughts and feelings, relationships, social and spiritual support, financial stability, and their spirituality in and of itself. And we're going to talk about that in just a few minutes. So when a serious illness is experienced by a person, I'm sure a lot of you here have had experience with that. The way you approach things, your perspective on life might change. The way you are able to problem solve, the way you're able to face the illness is very unique to an individual. And therefore, it's also important for us to understand what are their coping styles. What are the resources, the social resources available to them? And is it impacting their sense of well-being as well? So all of these things can only be checked when you do a psychosocial assessment and then go on to provide the right kind of psychosocial care. And we talked about total pain in the introduction session. And we talked about the fact that when a person reports their subjective pain on a pain scale, it is absolutely important for us to remember that the physical pain reported by a person is compounded and made worse by their current life circumstances. So if you want to diminish somebody's pain, if you want to mitigate their pain, you can't just do it through medication. You have to go into the psychosocial aspects of their life, and the prevention of future suffering and the relief from present suffering is what is going to finally bring that number down on the pain scale. And as a clinician, my responsibility is to assess all the contributor factors leading to total pain. And this is my role in the interdisciplinary team. So this is going to become a familiar, I think, graphic for you. And I've shared this also in the beginning. I'm just going to put it here to remind you one more time that there are different quadrants that contribute to the experience of total pain. And then we're going to come back to this diagram a little later today. Now, we've answered the why. Now is the what. And what is the aim of assessment? The aim of psychosocial assessment is to identify problem areas which result from illness and may influence the well-being of patients and their families. So it is to assess how the illness has impacted them and how this in turn will impact them back and their sense of well-being. And what does it involve? It involves collecting information, identifying and honoring strengths, resources, and needs. So it's not just about, random wool gathering and, okay, just tell me your life story, tell me, where you're at, what your status is, none of that. It's, it is that, plus it's also important for us to identify the positives, not just the negatives and the gaps. And it's important for us to remember that assessment and the gathering of this information is an ongoing process. It doesn't stop. So while your intake assessment might be quite heavy in terms of the information coming in for the first time, we have to constantly go back to our assessments, because the selection of goals and interventions depend on what is being assessed. So you can't assess everything at the same time, and some things take priority over others depending on, what is that person's, intensity of total pain and what is the highest contributing factor at the moment. And also it's because the psychosocial needs of patients and their families and the caregivers change over the course of the illness. So when someone comes to you first with a diagnosis of cancer, their needs will change over time, because as the illness progresses, the financial situation of the family changes, the mobility, the physical well-being of the patient changes, social support might change, so many things might change. They might need to sell their house in order to pay for treatment, so suddenly shelter is also a problem for them. So you have to constantly go back and keep assessing how the illness is affecting their lives. And where do we get this information from? The patient and the caregivers, of course. And there are collateral sources like friends, relatives, neighbors. I would even say, other members of the community. I would even add, in some cases, your local, your frontline workers. They might have a lot of information about the person. You have the local PHCs that might be able to give you some information. So there's lots of different sources, but these are the primary sources. And the cornerstone of our service delivery at Pallium India is our home care team, is our home care service delivery. And why is that one of the most critical areas of interventions for us? Is because a full assessment can only happen when you visit somebody at home. It's very different seeing somebody in a clinic. It's very different seeing somebody in an outpatient department or even in a hospital in an inpatient unit. It's only when you go into their home that you really get to know them in that regard. It's not to say that you can't do a good job in the IP or OP, but there are certain aspects of psychosocial care which cannot be garnered, of assessment rather, that cannot be garnered just by asking a question. A lot of it is about observation as well, and I'm going to take you through that. So what, again, are the areas of assessment? There's plenty. And over the years, the social officers or social workers in Pallium India have had to really put up with me, because I've increasingly added to this list of areas of assessment. And I have to say that I find that their assessment is absolutely incredible. And a lot of the reason why we're able to provide families with the care they need is because our social officers, our social workers, our community officers are really able to cover all of this information about our patients and their families. So patient and family overview, insight about the disease, that is. What does the family look like? Who talks to whom? Socioeconomic status of the family, environmental assessment. And when I say environmental, I mean the space they inhabit. Psychological distress, spiritual impact of the illness, psychosexual issues that might emerge from the illness. And finally, it's at the end of all of that, what are the interventions and plans, and what are the goals of care? So before I go into each one of these, I want to just hear from you. I see a lot of apologies in the chat box for not turning on the cameras. That's okay. At the best of times, my internet is shaky. So I'm just going to stop here for a second and, just sort of come back to testing the temperature of the group. And is there any comment that anybody has? Is there an area that we might have missed out on that you have used in your practice and found helpful? We've just done a sketcy overview. We'll go into more detail later, but is there anything that strikes you as immediate thoughts at the moment? You can use the chat box. You can unmute and you can put your hand up, and maybe we can then help you unmute and you can share your thoughts and comments also. I'll just sit with you for a minute here. If you have any questions, you're welcome to ask them too. No?
Yeah, I find this really interesting. Sorry, can I speak up?
Yeah, Vijay, please.
Yeah, very interesting about gathering information. But when we are trying to speak to the neighbors, relatives, how do we, like, is it kind of trespassing on the line of privacy and, family issues coming up, popping up, and then permission? How do you navigate through that?
Okay, great question. And we'll also be taking that up a little bit in our communications module. But great question, and thanks for flagging it. So firstly, that allows me to then share with you the very important fact that I'm very sorry. Your first and foremost source of information is your patient and the family. When I go back to the presentation now, I will show you something that we call the eco map. And that's where, when you need secondary information, you go to. Now, when I say neighbors and stuff, it could also very well just be more practical information. It's very important for us to maintain the confidentiality and the trust of the patient and the family. So I'm not going to go to the neighbor and say, tell me, do they really get along as a couple? Or, are they fighting? I'm not going to ask them stuff like that. But I might ask them stuff like, is this family been increasingly isolated ever since this person fell sick? Do you, things like that? Or what are some of the difficulties you've observed that might be hampering the kind of care they really need? So things like that. So I'm going to steer clear of private information. I might use it to corroborate some things. For example, about, maybe there is a child at home that needs a little bit more attention and care. And then I might, with the permission of the family, speak with the neighbors about it, because they might not want to ask, if they can get some help from them in that regard. So that kind of thing. It's very, I would say it's very intuitive. And but the cardinal rule would be to stay away from private information, and always that should be coming to you from the patient and the family. So I hope I've answered your question.
Yes, thank you.
All right, thanks very much. So I'm going to go back to the presentation now, and let's talk about each of those pieces. Yeah, patient and family overview. We talk about basic demographic details, and occupation before and after the illness, and primary caregiver and the relationship that they might have with that they have with the patient. Now, this is again a very broad. These are just broad bits of information that we want, and the more detailed bits I'll take you through that in just a second. So, who they are, where they live, occupation before and after illness, because it's important to also know how many people have lost a job on account of the illness. And that tells you then about their financial status a little bit better. And who is taking care of this person? Is it a spouse? Is it a daughter-in-law? Is it a grandparent? Is it a relative or a neighbor? And these are very important things, because you also want to know who you want to get in touch with in case you need to. Now, when we talk about insights, in palliative care, this is something that is quite critical, because this is for the patient and the family. So firstly, I want to know, does the patient know about his or her diagnosis? And how many of them know about it? There's a tendency also for collusion sometimes, where the patient is not told the diagnosis per se, or they're told a part of it. Prognosis. Now again, tricky for those of us who are new to this, in the sense that I may know that I have a disease that is advancing and it's going to leave me quite debilitated or whatever. It might be life-threatening. But am I accepting that prognosis is a different thing altogether. So you with me? So I might know that this is a serious illness. I might know that the outcomes are not usually good. Do I believe that that's going to be the case for me? No. I might just be in denial of it. So it's not enough to just say, yes, they know about the disease. Yes, they know the prognosis. There are varying levels of acceptance when it comes to the prognosis. And even the prognosis they think they know might be different from what the actual prognosis is, because very often the family will step in to protect the patient from that kind of information. Okay. And thirdly, what do they know about palliative care? This is also very important because unfortunately, I have found over the years that people who are being referred to palliative care are given a very different picture of it. So either they're told that, yeah, these guys will just take care of you. You just go to them, and they're sent to us with zero explanation. So they come to us thinking we are a next form of intervention, which is curative. So do they know what they are with us for is very important. And some people may not, but it's so important for us to, how we deliver that, because we don't want them to think that palliative care means it's the end of the line, because that's one of the biggest myths about palliative care. Unfortunately, they've been referred to us at a time when there can be no more curative intervention. But does that mean that this is a hopeless situation? No. So if you figure out that the family does not have any insight on what palliative care is, that is your first and foremost difficult conversation. People talk about breaking bad news, and they usually tell you that breaking bad news is about telling someone they're going to die. Try telling somebody about palliative care, even when they're not terminally sick. It's a very, very difficult conversation. And different people in the family are going to have different levels of acceptance towards it. It's usually at this point also that we find that different siblings or different caregivers have different opinions. No, why are we doing this? Let's go back, let's try another doctor, So how you break the news to them about what palliative care is and what we can do for them is one of your, what we call a breakpoint conversation. So in communication, we'll talk about breakpoint conversations, which are conversations that happen at critical times. And a lot of people think that it's only towards the end, but no, it's actually through the course of the entire trajectory. So that's as far as insight goes. Family structure and dynamics. And for this, we have this absolutely beautiful, versatile tool called the genogram, which many of us think we know how to use, but most of us don't use as well as we should. It is a very, very helpful tool. And what I like about it especially is that it can really cut down your text. I don't have to write pages and pages and pages describing a family if I just know how to do my genogram properly and my team knows how to read it. And it also, we need to just get a quick check on what the history of illness is in the family, not just in terms of genetic predisposition, but also how has the family generally dealt with illness in the past. And quickly, a little bit about the genogram. We all know it as the family tree. It was Murray Bowen who came up with it. And what it really is a graphical representation of a person's family over a minimum of 3 generations. Yeah, over at least 3 generations. And this genogram tells us about structure, it tells us about dynamics, it tells us about the strengths and the resources available to the family. It's an incredible tool, and I find that it's so simple and basic that most people skip it because they think it's not worth their time. But if you get this right, the amount of time it cuts down and saves you is amazing. And it can, a well-done genogram is a whole story in itself. And the kind of information that you can get from a genogram is not just names, age. You can also put down things like education and occupational, profiles, and also emotional relationships, which is what dynamics really are. So you have the structure, and for structure, there are different kinds of. These are the universally sort of accepted symbols used in genograms. But if you just do a Google search, you'll find that people have just evolved these genograms to suit their settings. And so you have things that are used in, public health. You have genograms that are used in, the substance use community, all kinds of things. So depending on what it is you want to focus on, there are symbols for everything. And so simply, like male is square, female is circle, a single line is married, a single line across like this is separated, a double line means they're divorced. You have all kinds of symbols for children and the sort of, whether it's an adopted child, a foster child, whether the person is pregnant, so on and so forth. So I'm not going to go into details. Most of you might already be familiar with this, and some of you might, if you're new to it, like I said, there's plenty of stuff on the internet also. But in addition to structure, we want to know the emotional relationships between people. Now, I can't write one Mahakatha about every person in the family, but if I just use these symbols, it immediately tells me that, hey, these guys don't talk to each other. So maybe this is not the best source of information regarding this, or if there has been reported abuse, need to know about that as well, right? Because that is going to impact the emotional well-being of the other person. If there is a conflictual or a hostile relationship, then probably not very helpful when it comes to making certain important decisions about healthcare interventions and so on. And there are people who might be extremely close to one another emotionally, and there might be some people who just don't talk to each other. And we all know families that these different relationships exist. So not to scare you, but this is for you the range of emotional relationships that you can actually show. Now, not all of you are going to need all of these different skills. I just really like to build on them because, like I said, it can just tell me a whole story in one page rather than me, going through copious amounts of notes. And the thing is, your initial genogram might just be lines. It's only after you go back and talk to the family over and over and over again, suddenly you find, oh, now you know that these two don't talk to each other, they're estranged. Oh, these two are almost best friends. Like these two sisters are actually very, very close, they're best friends. This is and that are hostile. There's physical abuse in this relationship. So you can keep on adding to your original genogram, by the way. You don't have to keep creating new and new genograms. And that's something I encourage our team to do all the time, that go back, happily use colors, create a little legend, make sure, very importantly, that everybody on your team reads the genogram the same way. Because there's no point if only you understand the genogram and nobody else does. But I would really say have fun with the genogram. Now, like I said, this is a structural genogram, right? We know that Leela and Maran are married to one another. There's Mohan and Leela, and Sindhu, who is their daughter, and Shaji, who is their son, have gotten married. Sindhu has another brother. Sindhu is, wait a minute. Hey, Sindhu is married twice. So, and then there are children here. So there was a moment of confusion for me there, right? But then here's where we keep going back to talk to this family. And finally, we find that this is what the genogram starts to look like. Because now we know that Sindhu lives with Shaji, and Raju actually, he died. And we know that this aunt and this uncle don't get along with Shaji, basically his brother and his sister-in-law. And you also know that Shaji does not get along with his son from the previous marriage, right? Would anyone else like to read this out? Is there anything else you're seeing? I've given you lots of cues. Manisha, do you want to just go?
I just missed the last part. Could you just say that again?
No, I said, do you want to just read some parts of this genogram out for me? I've talked about how Shaji and Sharath don't get along. Shaji doesn't get along with his brother. But if you want to just,
yeah, this looks a little complicated and I'm just seeing it right on the screen. Okay.
So we don't have a legend really to help us here. Abhijit, please.
Yeah. Indu shares a good, Sindhu shares a good relationship with Indu, Bindu, and Sarath. Is that green stands for?
Yeah. I'm assuming, because this is not a genogram, and I'm assuming that that's what it is. It's a strong bond. Yeah.
Strong bond, yeah.
Yeah. Amal and Vimal are
That's
twins. That's the symbol for twins, coming from one point, two lines. And I'm thinking that Leela and Sindhu are also close. That's a single line closeness, but there's also double line closeness with her sisters, that you know that she's very close to them. Kashish, you want to go?
Yeah, Vimal and Sarat, they are good friends, I can say.
Yeah, yeah. Vimal and Sharat are good friends. So, so you have all these different, or it could, wait, depending on the legend. If the legend could also be that they have a slightly strained relationship. So I'm going to have to check that about the legend. But at first glance, yes, it looks like a lot of stuff is going on. But as you hone the skill of, putting together a genome, it becomes more and more fascinating. And I would really, like I said before, encourage you to have not fun in that sense, but get into it, because it's actually such a great skill. And I also know now that these five live together. Yeah. And I'm wondering what life must be like for Sharat. No. Now, Sindhu seems to be very close to both these sisters of hers. So sometimes she might be confiding in them when she's not confiding in others. The fact that these two are hostile towards him might indicate that he gets no support at all when it comes to caring for his wife. So we can't assume that just because he has a brother, the brother is helpful. So now over a period of time, we've realized that no, that family actually is not supportive. Just give me one moment, please. My apologies. Okay. So anyway, you're getting you get the idea. And now we're going to talk to you about ecomaps. And this is something that Anne Hartman came up with. And like a genogram is a pictorial representation of the family, this is a pictorial representation of the family in its social environment. So the family's relationship with its environment. And it's a snapshot view of important interactions of patient's family with different systems, groups, extended families, individuals, organizations. Now, I'm just going to show you what the ecomap looks like rather than talk about it. So here's the family. And a family typically has various social relationships, right? There's a relationship they have with their school that their children go to, the health services, and their attending physician. It could be, their family doctor. It could be so many different. It could be the local hospital that they go to, so on and so forth. Extended family. That's all the cousins and uncles and aunts and everything. The friends of the family, neighbors in the place that they live, the workplace of the father, the workplace of the mother. Local services could be any local services. It could be a local, there's a club over there. Local services. Manisha, what are local services? I'm blanking out here.
It is
A grocery store could be.
Ah, yes. Yeah. Thank you. Whoever said that, I couldn't see.
I was talking, there was
Newspaper man.
Yeah, there you go. All those people. Yeah, all your locals. And clubs, of course, that you're part of, or even your religious institutions, congregations, so on and so forth. Now, why do I need to know the family's relationship with all these different things? How is it going to help me help the family better?
These are all things which are indirectly or directly connected to the family's well-being, actually. So definitely they are playing some of the role in the well-being of that family. So suppose if you cut off local services, definitely the family is going to face some issues. And if they are having some issues with the neighbors, that's directly going to hamper the sanctity of the family.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Anybody else?
Plus, you will get to know additional information about the family, and not like in a probing way, but useful information that will help in the diagnostic or facilitating the care.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so much. So yes, and so like a genogram also, you can talk about the relationship the family has with that particular institution, organization, service, etc. So again, this looks complicated, but it's not, okay? So the church, very strong faith between the mother and the son and the church. They're both strong church goers. And here you have a reciprocal relationship. So the arrows tell you in which direction the energy flow is. Okay, in terms of support, in terms of warmth, in terms of even hostility or whatever it is. Now, for instance, Adam's buddies, hunting, fishing, drinking, all that with him, they don't like his wife. Probably because she doesn't want him to go out with them. Okay. Now, you have the school. And the school looks favorably upon this child. Yeah. This friends, small groups of friends interested in role playing, computer games, etc. So he has a great bond with his circle of friends. He also has a good bond with his counselor and mental health specialist. The older daughter, she's majorly into sport and she's good at it from the looks of it. And she's getting a scholarship because of that. So again, this is a very Americanized version, huh? But the Indian version also, you can understand how these different services and institutions and stuff. So again, it's a skill that we can build on slowly. Initially, you can make it very simple, keep it like this, and say, okay, they have good access to healthcare service, and healthcare service includes us, by the way, the palliative care team. They might have a not so good relationship with the extended family. The workplace, the husband might have a great relationship with his boss, but the wife now has to quit her job because she has to stay home and look after somebody. So that is a strained relationship now because she's constantly taking leave and things like that. So it's strained. So you get the picture, yeah? And so here is an eco map that one of our social workers drew. And again, as an example, right? So I know that in many of our states and cities, these youth organizations are very active. In Kerala, we have a very strong volunteer system. And that's what's such a huge part of the success of the palliative care program in Kerala is because of the community volunteers. And the community volunteer is really the bridge between the family and everybody else. So here you see that the wife has a self-help group from which she gets a lot of encouragement and support. And likewise with the church. The church is for the whole family, by the way. The arrow ends here. The panchayat member has a very weak sort of relationship with the family. But you know what? This eco map also tells me where I need to intervene. Maybe I need to go in and strengthen the relationship with that panchayat member because maybe the family is struggling with basic food, water, shelter. And I can't, as a healthcare provider, get into that, but maybe I can mobilize the panchayat member to do it for them. So my job here will be to turn this dotted line into a strong line. And hopefully after a month or two of our interventions, we're able to do that. Maybe they can't, this is a weak relationship because maybe the public health center is far away. Okay, so various things. And it really tells me the story of the family in a social context. If you really want to get crazy, you can do the genogram in the middle and then do the eco map around it. But I would strongly advise against that because then there's just too much going on the paper and then we don't know what on earth is happening. So, so that's the eco map. And I hope for some of you who are hearing about it for the first time, you find it useful because we certainly do. Okay.
One quick question.
Sure, please, by all means, yeah.
In the previous slide, the wife symbol is shaded, like, or in other words, what does it mean?
Patient. She's the patient.
Oh, okay.
The wife is the patient. Okay. All right. I'm just going to check the. Okay. Fine. So moving on. It's a very important slide, I think. There are only 4 kinds of people. Those who have been caregivers, those who are currently caregivers, those who will be caregivers, and those who will need a caregiver. Okay. And very often, they are the invisible patient because the needs of the patient come first and foremost. And the caregiver, who is the person on the front lines, They put their needs second, and it could be basic needs, right? Or it could be even rest, recreation. They feel guilty if they go out and have a nice time with their friends because, hey, somebody's at home feeling sick. But a lot of these people just put their lives on hold. And this last line here was put in by one of our social workers. And I love that that line is there. Please, let's not dehumanize caregivers by calling them bystanders. We have this, in my opinion, a very ugly word. And the definition of bystander is who stands by and does nothing. And that's not who a caregiver is. A caregiver is actually the opposite, right? And we use this word so freely in our healthcare systems now, like, we need a bystander, we need a bystander, we need a bystander. But if you really look at it, it's a very dehumanizing word. And it really takes away from everything that that caregiver really is. So it may not mean a lot, like people say, yeah, it's just a word. But I think it has a very disempowering impact. So it's also a very disrespectful term as far as most of us in palliative care are concerned. So let's try and take that out of our vocabularies. Okay, now we've looked at the family. We know their relationship amongst themselves. We know their relationship with their surrounding social system. Now we go into understanding them a little bit more. Do they have adequate food? How about clothing and shelter? And who is the breadwinner? Is the breadwinner the one who got sick? Who controls the finances? Now, very important, the breadwinner may not be the person who controls the finances, no? But I'm going to stop so I can see more people. But that's a particularly important role because the person who controls the finances is the person who makes decisions. Okay, I'm going to repeat that. The person who controls the finances is the person who controls the decisions. And that may not be the person who is at the bedside day in, day out, looking after the patient. So sometimes we talk to the primary caregiver and we say, oh, okay, this is the kind of intervention this person needs. This person needs an air bed. This person needs this. This person needs to come to the physiotherapist 3 times a week, etc., etc. And this caregiver will say, yes, yes, yes. Okay, okay, sure, sure, sure. The person who pays for all this might be sitting in Dubai, who may not understand the relevance of that particular intervention. Why do we have to do this? Yeah, like, why don't we just do something else in return? But because they're controlling the finances, very often they get the final say unless there is healthy communication and debate in the family and so on. So thoughts on that are welcome. If you find that your experience has been different, that's also welcome.
Ma'am, it could be also the case where the caregiver is the dominant person because he says that I'm the one working day and night. And so are you going to come down from Dubai and look after this person? You better listen to me. That could be the problem.
Yeah, true. But when it comes to some of the more expensive interventions, you'll find that that power dynamic quite often starts to shift.
Okay.
So yeah.
Yeah,
Sorry.
And that's also the one of the main barriers of the therapy also.
Yes, it can be. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Sajan, you were going to say something?
Yes, I mean, those are real practical issues wherein the caregiver is not the decision maker or the person controlling the money. Then it becomes really challenging. It's like it becomes like a corporate office where person who needs to go do the things and then not getting the amount released by the whatever accounts department. That kind of a situation where things don't happen and ultimately or eventually the suffering person, the patient, continues to suffer more. So that is actually a real practical. So a part of the palliative care could be educating or bringing awareness to the caregiver as well as or understanding initially itself who is the person who is sourcing the funding for all this care, and then having a talk with them to make them aware that this is the situation, so you better both work together if they are different,
Yeah.
so that kind of.
Absolutely. Thank you for those insights. Also, I just want to call to attention something that I don't want to stereotype and generalize, but I also find that these are significant statistics. 80% of caregivers around the world are women. And in our context in India, you'll find that it's actually the most disempowered woman in the house. A daughter-in-law, or, the youngest unmarried sister, or somebody like that, or the unmarried aunt, or something like that. So, or of course, the wife.
Yeah,
But-
or even the mother who is a homemaker, not having
Yeah.
any source of income.
So you have a double whammy of somebody who's anyway, or the bottom feeder when it comes to the economic status in the family. And then you have them pulling their weight. 1 second, sorry, please. I sorry, other caregiving roles. But yeah, so you have that social dynamic also playing in. And it's sometimes a lopsided sort of issue. Recently, I was, sort of working with a family where they're well off. The mother was okay, she was elderly, she was frail, but then she had a sentinel, what we call a sentinel event. A sentinel event is especially in the older generation where a fall or a stroke or something. And after that, boom, it's downhill from there. So the mother had a stroke and is almost in a vegetative state, and she's with her second husband in Kerala, and one daughter is in Delhi from the previous marriage, and one daughter is in the US. And the one from Delhi keeps coming down and constantly attending to the mother and so on and so forth. Now, in terms of status within the family, the two sisters are the same, but one is in the US, and this is during the pandemic. And they had some ideas about pain relief and addiction and things like that. Whereas, this daughter, she said, I know her and I'm sitting next to her and I can sense that she's in pain, she's in discomfort, but because she's in the semi-vegetative state, she's not being able to express it, but I know that my mother is not entirely comfortable. But this conversation is going on about pain relief. And the other daughter insisted that the family buy an airbed that cost something like 1.5 lakhs, an airbed. And she insisted that that's the kind of thing that the mother needs. And this sister is like, we don't need an airbed that costs 1.5 lakh of rupees. With that money, we can do so much more. Maybe we can hire a home nurse, So different dynamics play out also in terms of distance, guilt, a sense of, okay, I can't be there, so I'm going to pay for it. But then when I pay for it, you better get it done. So there are all these different things. And it's important for us to know that, because that's one of the most critical dynamic, most critical definitions or influencers of dynamics within families. And this becomes more and more apparent as we get closer to end of life, when some of the more difficult decisions have to be made. Okay. Source of income, of course. Do they have any debts, loans? And like I said in our first session, 55 million Indians are pushed below the poverty line. We have to make sure that the debts and loans don't keep on increasing. So how can we do that? What are they taking loans for? Is it for another futile intervention? And what kind of social support is available vis-a-vis like government schemes, local financial support, and so on? And oftentimes we find that the families are not entirely aware of this. And because every state in India also has variations and things, very often it's our social workers who do that last mile linkage and say that here you are, you're eligible for this kind of subsidy, you're eligible for this. And that goes towards, reducing the financial burden a little bit at least. And of course, education of children, has it suffered as a result of the socioeconomic status? We do a quick environmental assessment in terms of, and this is where the home care visit becomes really important, because this is where we know we look at what kind of house do they live in? Is it their own house? Is it a rented house? Is it kacha, or is it in ruins? Is it in need of repair? So many times we have found that people live in homes that the roofs are leaking and so on, especially in Kerala, those of you who are familiar with the Kerala monsoons. And you have a sick person in the house and the roof is leaking, or the house is threatening to fall down around the family. The rent is cutting into their expenses big time. So there's so many different things, and that is a huge amount of, it's a huge source of stress. It's a huge source of stress. So we actually also ran a program where we had specific funding for home repair and renovation. If the person doesn't have adequate shelter, then no amount of care is really gonna help. Position, and by position I mean the physical position of the patient in the house. Is there overcrowding? Are they left in a corner by themselves? Is there any ventilation and light where they are? Why are these things important? Would anyone like to just share thoughts on this? The position of the patient, physical position of the patient inside the house. Anyone want to comment on that?
Does it affect the psychological well-being?
Does it?
I think so.
Those of you who think it does affect the psychological well-being can use the emoji and reactions buttons at the bottom. How many of you think the position of the patient in the house affects their psychological well-being? Yeah. Yep.
And emotional.
And emotion. Purnima, you want to say something? Oh, people are just raising their hands. All right. Okay. Okay. Yeah, it does. I remember attending to a patient in Delhi where this guy was, this gentleman, he retired as very, very high up in the Navy. And he had access to the best hospitals in Delhi. Like he had your top 3 doctors in Delhi on speed dial. And we facilitated, finally, of course, he was sent, and beautiful penthouse apartment in Gurgaon and all of that. And finally, we have a 1-hour home care assessment. And we find that this gentleman is in a corner of the room with all the amenities. The doctor basically also suggested, why don't you move his bed to closer to the window? And it had never occurred to the family that that might be something that might be of use. But immediately this man, over the next few days, his mood changed. And he started feeling better because he wasn't staring at a blank wall anymore. And, families as supportive as they are, you're not going to be able to sit around and, be next to them and entertain them all the time. And this is not just for people who are bedbound, by the way. Even the elderly and the frail. There is something called proximal separation, which means you can be physically close to somebody and that person is still alone because no one's talking to that person. Sure, the grandmother is in a joint family in this house where everybody lives, but the grandmother is always alone in her room, where the maid will go and give her a khana once, twice, 3 times a day. Occasionally, somebody will go and pop in and say hi to her. Maybe somebody might play a round of cards with her. But otherwise, she's utterly lonely. So it's not just, physical loneliness. I see someone saying hygiene matters, so home should have good ventilation. Yes, hygiene is really, really important as well. And ventilation, just natural light, and a lot of natural light, a lot of ventilation really does a lot for your well-being. Now, when you're sick, after a while you want some fresh air. And if you don't get that, you don't feel very good, do you? Okay, so coming back to this environmental assessment, also the kitchen, sometimes just to see how is the food being stored. Is there a smokeless chula, or is it like, there's smoke billowing in the house, which might be making the person feel worse? Is there waste disposal done? And this ties back to what Ira was saying about hygiene as well, and vectors and rodents, things like that. Water supply, so important. What is the frequency with which they get water? What is the distance to the source of water? Method of collection and transportation. And I'm going to just tell you here that once we went to visit somebody in their house, and it was an elderly couple living by themselves. And the nearest water source was about 600 meters away over undulating terrain. And she was bedbound, but he had to take a bucket every day and slowly walk 600 meters in one direction and come back with full buckets. It took him about an hour and a half to do that. At which point she was alone. And if she needed anything, no, but also it was affecting his health, right? So one of the simplest interventions was for us to make water available in their house. That saved the man many hours in a day. And also it put less pressure on his back and on him in general. And prevention of suffering is also palliative care. So that was one way we managed to prevent some amount of suffering. Access to the main road, to the hospital, the pharmacy, to groceries. We talked about that in our first session when I shared that picture of that young man in his home who didn't get physiotherapy, right? So how accessible is different services to this family? Okay. After we do an environmental assessment, and by the way, it's not one after the other, but these all observations happening parallelly. It's important to do psychological distress assessment because of course, illness affects the mental health of people. There's anxiety, there's depression, there's all kinds of things. And it could also trigger past mental health issues. And the emotional well-being of a person is certainly affected. There is something called anticipatory grief, which we will go into more detail when we talk about grief further in the modules to come. And also the coping mechanisms, right? So families or people that had difficulty coping with crisis or had difficult or inadequate coping mechanisms, let's say, or faulty, unhealthy coping mechanisms, when the time comes for a crisis, so I'm so sorry. Sorry. If people had unhealthy coping mechanisms before a crisis hits, when a crisis hits, it only gets more dysfunctional. And that's true for families as well. So when that happens, there are added stressors that individuals within the family start to feel. So it's important for us to also understand when we do the genogram and we see who's hostile towards whom and who's supporting whom. Is the patient the one who is always the nurturer and the one keeping the family together? Now that the patient is sick, what's happening to the rest of the family? How is it affecting their mental health and their psychological well-being? All of those factors come into play. And of course, I just want to say one thing here, that obviously not all of us are equipped to actually, do the interventions. So it's really important for us to know when to hand off to a psychologist or to a psychiatrist as needed. Spiritual assessment. Tricky one, but you're gonna have a whole session on spirituality later. But spirituality, like I think I mentioned in the first session, has to do with connection, strength and comfort, hopes and concerns, purpose and meaning. Okay, these are the 4 sort of quadrants really. And our spirituality, each of us, and I just want to reinforce, I don't mean this only in a spiritual, in a religious sense, how we connect to the world around us, where we find comfort and strength. Some find it in prayer, some find it in music, some find it in friendships, some find it in pets and animals, hopes and concerns regarding the illness, about their families, about anything. And what is the purpose and meaning of my life now that I have this illness, or somebody I love very much has an illness? Now, am I primarily a caregiver? Or, what is the meaning of my life? To be of service. I see so many caregivers emerging from that whole journey, wanting to then, go out and make sure that other people don't have a difficult journey like they did. And it's such a powerfully transformative experience for a lot of people. And for some people also, it's a very destructive one. So depends entirely on the kind of experience it is for the individual. And very quickly, I just want to show you this. This is the spiritual assessment questionnaire. And this is this, right? Connection, meaning, purpose, joy, whatever. So strength and comfort, hope and concerns. And this came out in the Journal of Advanced Nursing. And I find this to be a very nice tool for this kind of spiritual assessment. And if you look at the questions, now I'll just take a random connection. Persons or communities you look to for support. What role do they have in your care? Do you have an image of power greater than yourself? If I talk about strength and comfort, is there anything that is comforting to you right now? What helped you get through difficult times in the past? Who or what is your source of strength now? Now, why I find this particular tool so appealing is because not only does this give me information about the person, it also allows me to practically and very tangibly reframe somebody's state of mind. Let me try and explain what I mean. It's very easy when somebody is sick to get caught up in the negative loop of it. You know, what all has been taken away from you, what is difficult, what are, you know, where the gaps are, where the barriers are, where the difficulties are, all of that. But the questions in this spiritual assessment tool, to me personally, have allowed me to engage with the patient and the family in a meaningful way that also helps me to take them back to these sources of strength and make them think about that. Or it might, you know, it might revive a healthy coping mechanism in them. So it's not a conversation you can have within, say, 1 or 2 meetings, but in some patients, they're happy to talk to you about it. But it is a very, very handy tool. And I would even suggest that you don't do it as a questionnaire, don't do it as a checklist, but work it into your conversation. And so that's how it's worked really well for me. And that's what I would also recommend that those of you trying it out do for yourselves. Okay, so this will be shared with you along with the PowerPoints. So, okay, psychosexual issues. We don't talk about this. We don't talk about sexual issues at the best of times. We're certainly not going to do it when somebody is sick, huh? But so important. How has the illness impacted sexual intimacy and the quality of a relationship between two people? Most people don't want to go here. Okay. And I have a lot of people also asking, how is this going to help me help them? I mean, you know, it's none of my business, first of all. I can see some of you smiling because we're talking about confidentiality and like privacy and things like that. And how are you even going to word this question? How are you going to have this conversation with somebody, huh? So I give you a couple of scenarios. And those of our social workers who are present, who I know Manisha has done quite a bit of work with the rehabilitation in the halfway home. And Manisha, may I request, like, I know that you, without taking names, like, you know, what are some of the areas in which you find that this was a really important area for you to do an assessment?
So I have faced these issues when it comes to people who have met with spinal cord injury, specifically in these cases. So, but even then, this is like a very difficult topic which has to be dealt with. So considering the age that I am in right now, it's difficult to build a rapport with the patient and family to initiate a conversation about the psychosexual issues. But there has been a lot of scenarios where they've come to us, at least the caregiver comes to us and tells us that this person has doubts about us right now, since his abilities or since he's in a different state right now. They are still doubting if I am going in a wrong direction. So people has all these types of concerns, but then addressing that has been a very difficult task.
Thank you. And so this is a problem, right? Because as a 40-year-old married person, a woman is more likely to open up to me than to my social worker who's 23 and unmarried. Although, I mean, I'm not going to get into the morality of these kind of conversations, but again, there are women who are so alone in this experience that when someone comes and talks to them about it, it's a relief. And maybe they realize that there is no solution, but just to be able to vent and talk about it is so essential. And I think to large extent cathartic. Yeah. Now I want to just put this sort of image, this sort of scenario out to you. Young woman, arranged marriage, gets married to a young man. Within 2 months of their marriage, he has a bike accident, spinal cord trauma, is now a quadriplegic, and she is his now lifetime caregiver. Yeah. So she doesn't know him very well. Family is also new to her. She had a lot of hopes and aspirations also. And here she is. I cannot tell you how common that scenario is. Now, who's going to talk to her about her psychosexual issues? So for all practical purposes, and Manisha was talking about something it's a very pervasive pattern that we see. Young woman, married, husband's in a wheelchair. She is constantly under suspicion for being promiscuous and unfaithful. Constantly under suspicion because the husband is not being able to fulfill his physical, he's not able to be physically intimate with her. So even if she goes to the grocery store and takes like 20 minutes extra, there's some tension when she comes back. So in the West, there are better systems in place where there are actually, there's a lot of emphasis on how somebody who's an educator can actually sit with the family, with the couple, and actually, have a very frank conversation about these kind of issues. And, alternative ways in which they can be intimate with one another and so on and so forth. But in India, we don't even want to discuss it, right? We don't even want to acknowledge that there might be an intimacy issue there. But this is such a vital part of a sense of well-being, especially in couples. So very important for us. I'm not giving you any solutions. I'm just giving you something to think about. And I'm just going to move along now because I see that we have not a lot of time left. Okay. So once we've determined all these different things, we figured out who the family is, who talks to whom, how do they communicate with the larger world outside, and what is their status in terms of their resources, their psychological well-being, their sexual health, whatever else it is. Now is when we come up with the goals of care and what might they need in terms of interventions. A lot of people need information. The biggest thing people lack is appropriate and adequate information. The healthcare system very often, and I don't mean any disrespect or offense to any of our doctors or any other medical professionals here, but very often it's appalling how little a family knows about the condition they have. They don't have the information. And it could be about the disease state, it could be about the interventions, it could be about the options. It's also very, very few people are asked about their psychosocial health. So they need information. Information is one of the greatest interventions that you could practice, and just taking people out of that space of that limbo is increasingly is incredibly helpful. To become a liaison person between the patient and the family and other sources of support, of other sources of intervention. Like I said, the panchayat member might need to be spoken to. Maybe the principal of the school needs to be talked to about, paying a little bit extra attention. Or even the teachers for that matter, that yes, this child is going through a lot of difficulties back home. So if he's not performing well in school, please don't yell at him in front of all the other kids because he's already going through a really hard time. That's also liaison, and that's also supporting a child when they really need it. Regular follow-ups with the family is very important, because we may not always have the answers, but just knowing that there is somebody who's walking with them and is actively trying to find ways to help them navigate this journey is really, really helpful. Bereavement support after the patient has died. We will talk about bereavement later, so I'm not going to get into that. Rehabilitation, not just physical, but also vocational, education, so many things. Facilitation, just, facilitating access to certain things like government subsidies and so on. Facilitation of even care, getting someone in the neighborhood or in the community to come and participate in the active caring of this family. And supportive counseling, of course, is something that we can always provide them with. And when we do assessments, it's not random, it's not rambling, it's purposeful. Every observation has to have a purpose. Every conversation has to have a purpose. And what that purpose is reveals itself over and over again as you spend more and more time with the family. And always it's, okay, the last time we decided that this is the goal of care, I would ensure that they have a regular water supply in addition to getting their medication delivered to them, once a week. I'll do a comprehensive geriatric assessment of the elderly caregiver, so I make sure that this person doesn't develop health issues of her own. We have 2 patients in the house. So specific goals of care. And then the next time you go, you're observing to see if your intervention has worked and if you can build on that in any other way. And your conversation is then influenced by that. And of course, if you do an inaccurate or incomplete assessment, your goals and interventions are going to be inappropriate and inaccurate as well. So you've got to lay that foundation before you can build the house. We have a few minutes, so I'm going to just take you through this one case. Okay. We have a 30-year-old woman, let's call her Mrs. D, who was diagnosed with cancer of the cervix in 2014. This is an old case. She had chemotherapy and radiation followed by a colostomy. I hope everybody here knows what a colostomy is. She was referred for pain management to our unit. At the time of registration, she presented with severe pain, infection of the colostomy site, and a very foul discharge from her vagina. And she had a few fistulas also. She looked very anxious and scared. She had no idea about palliative care. And from the medical records and present disease progression, the team was pretty sure that her prognosis was very, very bad. All we knew about her is that she's married. Her husband is 35 years old. He's a daily wage worker. Her child is 6 years old and is going to school. So I'm just going to leave this up for a few more seconds so all of you can read through it properly. Okay, so here's Mrs. D. Now, I'm just gonna, sorry. What areas are we going to assess? Based on everything that I've just talked to you about, what are some of the things you want to know about Mrs. D? And where are you going to begin? Where are you going to begin with Mrs. D? Feel free to unmute, feel free to use a chat box. There are no absolutely right and wrong answers, so don't hesitate or don't be reluctant.
So
Jane?
we are going to divide the into physical as well as psychological, social, and those parameters, spiritual. So in the physical, we can see that she has been in severe pain, and along with the infection at the colostomy site. And coming to her psychological status, she is very anxious and scared. And regarding her social, husband is 35-year-old and a daily wage earner, and a child who is like 6-year-old. So she may be having like what is going to be the future of this fellow, and a husband also like a daily wage worker, whether he'll be able to support his education or not. So this may be, she may be thinking of that. And then, so physically, we are going to work on pain management as well as some antibiotics for the infection, bring it under control, and then explain her about the disease process and how it's going to be, and then let her know about the prognosis, and then provide her some support, whatever we can give it from the government as from the NGOs, so that she is off this anxiousness and that insecurities about her future.
Wonderful. That was a really great round. Anybody else wants to also add or?
I think the starting point has to be the patient and the family overview, understanding the relationship with each other, family structure, the social economic status, the environment. That's what I can say.
Yeah. Even the family needs to be informed, is what Ira says. Yeah, the extended family here. Yeah. Anybody else?
I think Mannat was trying to communicate with us for a long time. Maybe there's another device switched on near you. If you could clear that, maybe we can hear you properly.
Yeah, I think it is so complicated in the sense that, I'm clueless where to begin, but all aspects of everything that we saw from in today's class, all of it are equally important. And I think, as Abhijit mentioned, it probably, needs to start with the family, immediate family and so on, and the environment that they are in. So yeah, just a minute.
Okay. Thank you. I think all of us are pretty much on the right track. So let's just see. Okay, this is a slide that's kind of randomly over here, but I'm going to come back to it in the end. Now, you were right. So 4 quadrants, physically, she's unclear about her prognosis. Okay, that could be a physical thing. It could also be a psychological thing. But she really doesn't know about her prognosis, and physically, that also, that has a bearing. Intense discomfort. Cervical cancer is one of the most painful cancers in the world because of where it is located in the nerve endings, the multiple nerve endings that are there in the sexual organs of the woman. And she's fatigued. Okay, she complains of being fatigued and she hasn't had a good night's sleep. We also find that she has a strained relationship with her husband and his family. Then we find that her colostomy bag and foul discharge has made her feel humiliated. The other thing about cervical cancer is that it results in a lot of malodorous discharge and leakage. Something like 40% of women suffering from cervical cancer are abandoned by their intimate partners, by the way. Hesitant to go out and interact with people with a colostomy bag because a lot of people have difficulty psychologically even accepting that sort of an intervention for themselves. And because she's so embarrassed about going out and meeting other people, she is further isolated because her embarrassment does not let her lean on the social support that she might actually have. We see this also with a lot of disfiguring illnesses like head and neck cancers and stuff. So, okay, anxiety about the future, and also generalized fear. And there's a lot of stigma associated with cervical cancer. So, so that's also a stigmatizing thing. And for a woman to be affected in her genitals is even more, it makes her feel shamed and guilty and all those things. It is sexually transmitted, but no one talks about the fact that it's the male who's the carrier, but usually the women are stigmatized for it as well. She doesn't necessarily have to be promiscuous to get the HPV virus. But anyway, there's a lot of stigma associated with the disease itself, and that is also preventing her from really seeking support or going out much. Lost wages for husband due to caregiving duties, and he's a daily wage earner, so every day's wages matter. Worry about the education expenses of the child, as what some of you have said. And another thing that came out was she lives in a very rural area, so access to the regional cancer center and the hospital was very, very tough. Spiritually, extreme spiritual distress. She couldn't understand why she had to suffer so much in spite of being a strong believer in God. And that's something, spiritual distress. We also find that, sometimes your faith is shaken, and that's very hard to come to terms with for people who have deep belief systems and values in that regard. Loss of connection with family and friends and community because of increased isolation, because of the stigma and so on, and loss of interest in all pleasurable activities. And so really, even music, all of those things that might have interested her at another time really have no pleasure for her. So this is the map, this is the cartography of her pain. And so this is where we now get the hint of what interventions can be provided. So what are some of the things, based on the last couple of sessions we've had, what are some of the things, looking at these 4 boxes? I'm not saying, it doesn't have to be in a particular priority order, but what are some of the things that you all could do for Mrs. D?
First, about the physical things we can address with medical management, like lack of sleep, fatigue, we can address by some medication. And regarding her socio-economic status is concerned, like, is she aware of the schemes which can help her because she is in cancer? So giving them financial support so that her husband and the child are they can continue their education expenses. And some, if she is very spiritually related, so some spiritual consoling or some prayer that would little bring her solace. And then regarding the psychosocial aspects, like her is not permanent, or we can give her, like, she may be like how to carry this all the time. We can tell her how to ambulate and how long that is going to be there with her. So these things, I think she may be little.
Thank you very much. Excellent interventions. Maybe just speak to her and tell her the scope of palliative care and what she can have access to. I've got a direct message for that. Yes, absolutely.
I would like to speak.
Yes, Mannat.
Yeah, so the first foremost thing that I feel here is the fact that she's very anxious. Actually, something I wanted to speak before, and thanks for making it clear with the presentation. The first foremost thing why I say psychosocial is the problem, the medical condition is going to be there for a long time. It's not going to go anywhere. I think the first thing a person needs is somebody to accept, hear, and comfort. So to be there and allowing the patient to ventilate about the needs and the fears the patient is going on with, and to I'm not a medical professional, but I think just making them aware of the facts that's going to come ahead in their life, and just being there as a support is something that makes a huge difference when they are very anxious about their future, and to deal with those irrational thoughts that are associated. And because she has a lot of physical pain associated with it, with her illness, comforting them by giving them a change in perspective and environment is going to help them.
Thank you, Mannat. I'm glad you were able to talk to us. That was really insightful. Thank you so much. I would also, in addition to all these excellent interventions that all of you have prescribed and described, and I'd see, talk about education support for the kids and all of that. Considering the kind of disease it is, a lot of psychoeducation for the family is also important in order to take away the stigma. And I would even say psychoeducation, if the community is if it's possible to do a community psychoeducation program, because finally the stigma that the family has to live with also has to be dispelled. If you want to connect them to their larger social network, then maybe, liaisoning with the local PHCs or something like that, and or maybe even student groups, a very, very powerful group of advocates, and to really talk about, the stigmas associated with this and to destigmatize it. I'm going to move on very quickly because I know we're past time, but thank you all very much for your inputs. And I'm just going to, the last thing I'm going to say is that Dr. Harvey Chochinov is this incredible person in Canada who has spent decades studying dignity. And he has written a book called Dignity Therapy. And he says the inability to acknowledge personhood and the insensitivity of not acknowledging personhood can be psychologically devastating. So while we address the medical condition and the physical symptoms, it's really important to see the person behind the disease. So disease is the disease. The illness is all of the stuff that the person experiences as a result of the disease. That's the difference. Illness is an experience. It's a 360 holistic experience, and disease is very specifically the physical. So in all of this, one of the biggest reasons we look at psychosocial interventions and assessments is to find ways to restore the dignity of a person. And that's one of the greatest things that we can do through our psychosocial interventions. I'm going to close with a few photographs. This was a man who was this is all with consent. This was a man who was quite close to the end of his life. And his wish was to celebrate his wedding anniversary with his wife, which was 9-10 months away. And we just brought it forward by his request because he wanted to just, give her a happy memory. Vocational rehabilitation, of course, we've engaged in all kinds of things, including, you've seen these two pictures, but there's somebody who makes pens, and there's somebody who wanted goats to rear goats and make that a source of income. Of course, we have support for children, which is educational as well as emotional. We run that program for education needs, but also emotional support for children who are bereaved. We have to remember that just like you would do with a medical intervention, you have to evaluate even your psychosocial interventions. It's not enough to just show up and listen to somebody. Your presence has to alter their quality of life in a positive way. And in order to do that, we have to have the humility to evaluate our interventions. And, I keep hearing this, this thing thrown at me saying, oh, noble profession. It's only noble if you're actually able to make that difference, right? So you have to evaluate your interventions, assess how the patients and families are benefited rather than what you think is good for them. Sometimes we think, we know what they need. No. I heard this remarkable story from a colleague who does children's palliative care in war-torn countries. And she said to me, we think they need medicine, we think they need food, but what they really need is toys and shoes. And we've talked about this, right? So what do they need and how have they benefited? But of course, the bigger logistical things also need to be addressed. Good documentation is invaluable. So you have to document your interventions, and wherever possible, use research validated techniques. And there is an art and science in psychosocial care, just as in medicine. So I'm going to leave you with those thoughts and bring the session to a close. Thank you all very much for a very interactive session. I really enjoyed my time with all of you today, and I hope that you found today's session useful. Anisha?
Thank you, Smriti ma'am, for this wonderful session. We do have a lot of comments coming up in the chat box as part of the discussion that happened, case discussions. Thank you all so much for the comments too. Yeah, so pretty much you've explained everything about how a psychosocial assessment should be and how the care plan should be in terms of considering the total pain of a patient and family. So thank you once again for this wonderful session. Thank you for joining us, and thank you all of you for being there with us, and see you all in the next session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Those with login issues are supposed to stay back, right?